Hello friends, and welcome to Ariel's Twilight Years, how to be a really old model. I'm in Colchester this month. I'm in Colchester for a shoot that isn't happening, and so I'm alone in a hotel room, which is really very nice, and I'm just shooting my own content because I messed up the date in my diary and my photographer thought the shoot was this morning and I thought the shoot was tomorrow morning. Even when you are a really old model, sometimes you get stuff wrong. This month, my video is about the worst things people have ever said to me at photo shoots. To be clear, the worst things that people have ever said to me are not on this list, because by far the worst things that have been said to me have been by strangers on the internet, sometimes on YouTube. So this list is confined to the things actual people have said to me during actual photo shoots. Mostly photographers, occasionally non-photographers. So let's get started from the least egregious right through to the most egregious. This was early in my career and I'd been taken away on location abroad by a photographer from the UK, and it was very exciting. I was still very new to modelling and I really liked working outdoors on location in a warm climate. And every evening the photographer took me out for dinner after the shoot, which was a very nice thing and I was very happy to do that. And as we walked down the street, he said in a voice of dissatisfaction and disappointment, "Not as many people are looking at you as I was expecting." I was quite flabbergasted, and I realise now, looking back, that the nice dinner after the shoot was perhaps quite an important part of his having taken me abroad in the first place. That he wanted, I guess, the sort of maybe notoriety that he thought he would get by being out with a glamorous model. But this particular glamorous model dresses down when she's not shooting because she doesn't particularly want to be stared at. I think he probably would have done better with some kind of exhibitionist, which I am most assuredly not. Sometimes photographers' motivations for photo shoots with you are not quite as clear as you might imagine, because he didn't do anything inappropriate on the shoot, but I think perhaps his priorities were different from what I might have imagined. And certainly, having had a few experiences like that, I am much more careful about who I work with for extended periods, because I am now aware that some people probably are looking for some kind of girlfriend experience, and that's not something I want to provide. I want to provide a collaborative experience where we create good pictures and hopefully have fun doing it. I was wrapping up a shoot with a photographer who was someone I'd worked with before, and the shoots were quite challenging. The environment was quite difficult and what I was being asked to do was relatively technically involved. The shoot was about 4 hours away from my home, and towards the end of the day he said, "It must be nice being a model, because at the end of the shoot you don't have to do anything, do you?" And I thought, well mate, first I have to get in my car and I have to drive for 4 hours. Then when I get home I have to unpack my suitcase and pack my suitcase for the next day. After that I'm going to wash and style my hair, and I'm going to shave all my body hair off. After that I'm going to make sure my manicure and pedicure are still in place. After that, I'm going to do my admin, and then I'm going to do some marketing. So I put it to you that actually that's a damn foolish thing to say to any professional, because in my experience, it seems to me that people often underestimate the behind the scenes work that goes into any given profession. And I think it's very dangerous to assume that because you don't see the work that they are doing behind the scenes, that they're not doing any. This was a photo shoot with someone I'd not worked with before, and almost the first thing he did when we met up for the shoot, which was at a location I'd rented because I was on tour, he asked me if I ever wore high heels, and I said no, I don't wear high heels except when I'm at work because I'm already so tall. And he said, "Oh really? What is your work?" Now, given that I was in a country which is not the country I live in, and we were shooting on a weekday, and we were working in a location that I'd paid for, and that he was paying me for my time, it did seem quite extraordinary that it hadn't occurred to him that my job might be being a professional model. So I said, "I'm a model." And I don't want to be too unkind, because he wasn't trying to be horrible, he wasn't trying to be rude, he just didn't think of the possibility that I did this for a job, because he did photography as a hobby. And I think quite often when your job involves providing a service that other people consume for enjoyment, perhaps sometimes they just forget that their hobby is your job. And so I don't mean to be overly judgmental, but it certainly is an attitude I have come across multiple times during my career. And I do think that my favourite photographers are the ones who acknowledge the fact that this is not just a job, but it's a career. Which leads me on to... I was again quite a new model, because the older you get as a model, the more experience you get as a model, and the more crabby you get as a model, the more people are unlikely to say this kind of nonsense at you. I was on tour with a photographer, we were abroad, and I mentioned something about my modelling career, and he laughed and he said, "It's not a career." Now, at the time I'd only been modelling a year. Just because a career is short, it doesn't mean it's not a career. Being a professional footballer could be quite a short career, or being a gymnast competitively could be quite a short career, but it is most certainly still a career. We call it a career because we acknowledge the achievement it represents. And now, almost 20 years on from the start of my career, I would put it to him that if it's not a career, what is a career? I don't know if he meant he didn't think it was skilled, in which case I don't know why he was paying me, or whether he didn't think it was serious enough to count as a career, or whether he didn't think it could be long term, but that doesn't make any sense, because careers can be extremely serious and yet short term because of the physical demands the job places on the body. I can't help suspecting that there is some sexism going into that reasoning somewhere, because it is a job predominantly done by women, and that it is very nice to look at pictures of models, and looking at pictures of models is not a career, but being in those pictures or taking those pictures most assuredly is. I was in New York doing an artistic nude shoot with a photographer in a great location, and he was a good photographer, and we were doing some really beautiful dance-based art nude. And he told me that his daughter was a model, and I was delighted. I said, "Oh, that's great. What sort of work does she do?" And he said, "Oh, she's a real model." Ow. This did not make me feel great about the work we were producing, because to me, what we were producing was real work. I mean, we were in a real photo studio, he had a real camera, I was being paid real money. It told me a lot about his attitude to the pictures we were creating, and I was there with a serious mindset trying to do my best, and I started to realise I think he's here with the mindset of looking at a naked woman, and I certainly was in no hurry to work with him again. I was talking to a photographer at a shoot, and I was talking about how grateful I was for my career and how much more financial security it's given me than I was expecting when I began it. And he said, "Because if that hadn't come along, you'd have had to be a waitress, wouldn't you?" Now, I feel as though being a model and being a waitress are not the only two job prospects available to women in the 21st century. I have never expressed any interest in catering. I've never had a job in catering. I have never been a waitress. And I can think of about 20 things I would have done if I hadn't become a model, not least the job I was doing before I became a model, which was a classical actress, which he knew. Through my career, I have noticed that quite a lot of people, without meaning to, underestimate the intellectual capacity of professional models. And I think that this is probably an example of exactly that, that in his mind, the only other job for the sort of woman who would become a model would be something relatively low paid, very traditionally feminine, and isn't generally a very high status role. It's a very illuminating thing to realise that people can look at a professional model, and indeed know a professional model quite well, and still not consider all the transferable skills that a successful model would be able to bring to the table in another role. And the idea that if I hadn't been able to do internet modelling, the only other option for me would have been being a waitress, it does strike me as a little singular. And as time goes by, I am less and less willing to let comments like that just roll by, because it's hard to see that as anything other than just unthinking sexism. And I'm not a big fan of unthinking sexism, or indeed thinking sexism. Again, I was quite a new model and I didn't challenge it at the time. I was doing artistic nude with a lovely photographer. We were shooting shots from the front, and after a while I turned round so he could take back shots with me against a window, and he said, musingly, in a very pleasant voice, "Oh, you're actually quite fat from the back, aren't you?" And I think it's just one of those situations where something he was thinking came out of his mouth, and it wasn't the wisest thing to say, but it's what he said. And I wish I could say I just shrugged it off, but for many years I used to worry about doing back shots because I used to be scared that everyone would be thinking what he had said. Indeed, it may be that that's what they all are thinking. Along a similar line, I was working with a photographer who I'd worked with first at the very beginning of my career, and about 12 or 13 years afterwards he booked me again, and it was very nice to see him. And he said a lovely thing to me. He said, "You know, you haven't changed a bit in 13 years. Then there was a pause. And he said, "Well, your face has." Now, I chose to take that as a compliment because I guess he meant my body hadn't, which is nice because indubitably it absolutely has. If only he'd stopped talking halfway through that sentence, that would have been a lovely moment. As it was, I spent the drive home looking at myself in the rearview mirror and wondering why he found it necessary to say that. Along similar body-shaming lines, although in my experience it is often male photographers who say this kind of not particularly sensitive thing about models' bodies, I did once have a model say one of the most appalling things to me. We were sharing a changing room and she looked at me as I was getting undressed and she said, "How have you managed to get so much work with such a weird body?" And now, looking back with a kinder mindset, I think perhaps it might have been because she was insecure about her own body and was taking comfort from the fact that perhaps my body didn't have all the ingredients that she thought would make the most successful model. And despite that, I'd had a successful career, so to be charitable, perhaps she was looking for professional pointers. But at the time, it wasn't much comfort. And finally, I'm afraid this is where it gets a lot less funny. I was working again abroad with a photographer and he was repeatedly pushing the boundaries of what I'd agreed on for the shoot. He was touching me repeatedly, inappropriately, but not so much so that I had gathered the courage to say he wasn't allowed to. Finally, he pushed me too far and I told him that wasn't acceptable to me. And in a break from shooting while we were changing lights, he said, "That thing you didn't want me to do, is it a question of more money?" And I said, "No, I've got plenty of money." And he looked very disappointed and he said something which has just chilled me ever since. He said, "Oh, most models are more desperate." And I realised right then and there, he hadn't booked me for my skill or for my looks or for my professional expertise. He'd booked me in the hope that I'd be in financial difficulties. And the fact that he hoped I was in financial difficulties suggested to me that he had succeeded with this technique before, and it just horrified me. And so I know this was a light-hearted video, but I want to end by saying that most of the people who say this kind of stuff to models at shoots, they're not a threat. But quite often what they're saying can be indicative of an attitude towards models or women or people that is not the most respectful or positive or healthy. And so although these things are by and large quite funny, I do think that it is worth being on your guard as a model, that when people say things like this, it might possibly serve as a warning that their attitude to your work and the photo shoot you are sharing with them might not be the same as your attitude. So there were my top 10 audaciously bad things that people have said to me at photo shoots. I would love to hear from you, whether you're a photographer or a model, about the worst things people have said to you, so please do comment below. Please like and subscribe. As always, it means the world to me. And now I'm going to eat a cake made for me by my lovely photographer friend John Tisbury, who's got his own YouTube channel. His wife Jill Tisbury made me this. And I will use it as a reminder that many photographers have the absolute best of intentions when it comes to their models, and they would never say all these ridiculous things like this. Many of my photographers have become beautiful, trusted friends, and I love them. But it is always worth being aware as a model that not all photographers are seeing you as a real human being with feelings and a career and limits. Thank you as always. Stay safe, everyone. I'm going to eat my cake now. Thanks for listening. Bye. Bye-bye now. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Shout out to Jill Tisbury.